Imagine a sterile, windowless room at Yale University in 1961. A man sits at a gray desk, his hand hovering over a row of 30 switches. He's an ordinary person, a family man, perhaps a regular at his local church, someone who, considers himself good. On the other side of a glass partition, another man is strapped into a chair with electrodes. The man at the desk is told that for every wrong answer, he must deliver an electric shock. As the learner screams in pain and eventually falls into an eerie, unresponsive silence, the man at the desk looks at the experimenter in the lab coat. The experimenter simply says the experiment requires that you continue. David Berlinski, the philosopher, often poses a famous mental riddle that feels very similar. He asks us to imagine a button that would give us everything we've ever desired: wealth, power, security, at the cost of the life of one anonymous peasant in China. His question is pointed. Who would you trust with that button? Berlinski's argument is clear. Without a supernatural supervisor or a higher moral authority like God, the human heart is a dark place, and that button will eventually be pressed by anyone who doesn't fear a divine judge. To him, religion is the only ultimate brake on our worst impulses. But what happened in that Yale laboratory tells a much more haunting story. The participants weren't godless nihilists. They were everyday citizens, many of whom held deep religious convictions. Yet 65% of them flipped every single switch, all the way to a lethal 450 volts. They didn't do it because they were greedy or lacked a moral code. They did it because they had found something to replace their individual conscience, a legitimate authority that told them it was okay. This immediate pivot from a personal moral stance to total compliance under a higher power suggests that Berlinski might have the problem backward. It wasn't the absence of a master that made these people dangerous. It was the presence of one. It raises a chilling possibility that the data, the history, and the psychology all seem to point toward. The button isn't usually pressed by those who answer to no one, but by those who believe they're answering to something higher.
That introduction, it grounds us perfectly in the central tension of this deep dive. Our mission today is to move beyond that philosophical riddle and really unpack the psychological mechanisms that enable moral actions, or as it often turns out, moral failures. We're going to explore the intense, almost counterintuitive impact that authoritative structures, whether those structures are sacred or secular or institutional, have on our personal ethical responsibility. We're really going to use the source material to explore not just the theoretical concept of a moral break, but what the behavioral evidence tells us about the accelerant of unethical action.
Okay, let's start right there then. The Milgram experiment. It's such a famous study, but that statistic, the 65% obedience to the maximum shock, it's really just the beginning of the story, isn't it? You're saying the true insight lies in the mechanism of that obedience.
That's absolutely right. Stanley Milgram's work, this was back in the early 1960s, and it just demonstrated this profound truth about human social dynamics. It's the overwhelming power of perceived, legitimate authority. The participants, you have to remember, were told they were assisting a learning experiment. They weren't bad people. They were recruited from the community. And they genuinely believed the shocks were intensely painful, maybe even lethal. You can see it in their extreme distress. They were shaking. Some had nervous laughter, sweating.
I think that's the part people often forget, the sheer emotional turmoil of the subjects. They weren't just cold, unfeeling robots flipping switches.
Exactly. Not at all. They pleaded with the experimenter to stop. But when the man in the white lab coat, and that coat is the symbol, right? The symbol of scientific authority and institutional legitimacy. When he delivered one of his prods, something like, "The experiment requires that you continue," or "You have no other choice, you must go on," their personal moral break, it just seemed to give way instantly. They didn't become monsters. They just engaged in a total transfer of responsibility. They saw themselves as agents following orders, not as independent moral actors.
So in that moment, the fear of disappointing the immediate established secular authority, this Yale scientist in the room with them, that became far more powerful than their internalized moral code. Or, for those who had one, the fear of that transcendental moral supervisor that Berlinski talked about. The dilemma was just resolved by outsourcing accountability.
That is the critical point. The authority figure provided a kind of cognitive shield. The subject thought, if something goes wrong here, it's his responsibility, not mine. I'm just following his instructions. This instantaneous ability to transfer accountability just demonstrates how fragile our individual moral break really is when we're faced with immediate, tangible pressure from a perceived master.
Okay, but I feel like I need to, introduce some intellectual friction here. How can we really compare the temporary authority of a university scientist in a lab coat, who the subject's only going to know for an hour, to a lifetime of deep religious conviction, a lifetime of community identity, the fear of eternal judgment? Aren't we kind of conflating two very different power structures?
That's a really important challenge. And no, we're not saying they are equivalent in scope, but that the mechanism of compliance is fundamentally the same. What Milgram showed is that authority doesn't need to be sacred or eternal to be effective. It just needs to be seen as legitimate within its frame of reference. The immediate physical presence of an authoritative command can trump abstract, distant consequences. And if an hour with a scientist can override decades of moral conditioning, you have to ask, imagine the power of an authority figure or an institution that commands total allegiance for a lifetime, tying ethical action not just to obedience, but to identity and salvation itself.
That actually makes the Milgram finding even more disturbing because it sets the baseline for human compliance so incredibly low. And we see these secular parallels to the obedience principle everywhere.
We do, absolutely. You can look at large-scale modern simulations designed to probe global moral patterns, something at the MIT Moral Machine Project. This was a massive data collection, tens of millions of decisions from people all across the world, and they were all responding to these complex, inevitable accident scenarios involving autonomous vehicles. They were forced to decide, for instance, should the car swerve and kill the passenger, or continue straight and kill 3 pedestrians.
Right, the classic trolley problem, just brought into the digital age for self-driving cars.
Exactly. And what the researchers found was a strong moral convergence between religious and secular societies globally. The morality wasn't fundamentally different when they faced that core dilemma of choosing who lives or dies. The differences they did find were mostly cultural. Things like who was saved, older people versus younger, or prioritizing the survival of passengers versus pedestrians. But the foundational moral choice, whether to intervene or not, that didn't drastically vary based on religious adherence, which strongly suggests that a functional shared moral intuition exists and it operates, imperfectly without needing a supernatural mandate.
Which supports the idea that the brake is already there. It just gets overridden by immediate factors, regardless of your belief system.
Yeah.
And this overriding isn't just about obedience, right? It's about situational factors, completely derailing our best intentions.
That observation brings us to another famous study, the Good Samaritan experiment, which was done at Princeton Theological Seminary. The researchers wanted to test exactly that, the impact of moral conviction against immediate situational pressure. So they recruited seminary students, the very people preparing for a career based on ethical guidance, and they instructed them to travel across campus to deliver a lecture on the parable of the Good Samaritan. The story about helping a stranger in need.
And on the way, they set up an actor, a man slumped in a doorway, visibly in distress, right on the student's path.
Precisely. And the researchers manipulated just one variable: time pressure. Some students were told they were early, they had plenty of time. Others were told they were already late and they needed to hurry. And the result was just stark. The deciding factor in whether a student stopped to help had nothing to do with their deeply held religious values, their career path, or their conviction about the parable they were literally about to preach. It was time pressure. If they were rushed, they ignored the person in need.
That's tragically ironic. They literally stepped over the victim of the parable while rushing to deliver a lecture about why you shouldn't step over the victim of the parable.
It perfectly illustrates that holding high religious or philosophical values does not, by itself, guarantee ethical action when you're faced with situational factors or just simple stress. And this is a foundational finding in behavioral ethics, the field that studies how people actually make ethical decisions, moving beyond that philosophical ideal of the rational moral actor.
So if we're not making decisions rationally, by running some kind of philosophical checklist in our heads, what does the data actually show?
Well, behavioral ethics research suggests there's very little robust evidence that teaching people to be brilliant moral philosophers, making them experts in Kant or utilitarian calculus, translates directly into improved ethical action. The real fight is against our own psychological wiring.
So all that time you might spend debating the ethics of the trolley problem could be totally irrelevant when a deadline or an angry boss is looming over you.
Potentially, yes. The field really offers 3 core messages that directly challenge the stability of our internal moral brake. First, most ethical decisions are made instinctively, intuitively, not rationally. We use mental shortcuts. Second, people tend to believe they are exceptionally ethical while routinely engaging in small, unethical actions. We're functionally blind to our own moral infractions. And third, Even the most well-intentioned people struggle because of these deep-seated cognitive limitations, social pressures, and immediate situational factors that just undermine their intentions.
That second point is the most humbling, I think. We all walk around convinced that we are the hero in our own moral narrative, but the data suggests we are routinely bending or breaking the rules without even noticing. And this failure isn't malice most of the time. It's faulty wiring cognitive errors we all share.
You've hit on the terrifying truth. This isn't necessarily a failure of character, it's a failure of cognition. We can even detail some of the most influential psychological biases that systematically erode ethical decision-making.
Okay, let's start with the concept of the slippery slope.
That's incrementalism. It's our inability to notice gradual, minor changes. Humans are just acutely poor at detecting slow erosion. This means minor rule infractions, let's say a small, unjustified expense report, can grow larger and larger over time, escalating to serious, even felony violations, almost unnoticed by the person doing it. They didn't wake up one day and decide to embezzle millions. They started by improperly expensing a $10 taxi ride because the policy was a bit ambiguous. That created a slight dissonance, which their brain immediately rationalized away. Oh, it's not hurting anyone. The next time it's $50, then $500, and soon they're in way too deep to stop.
They never saw the inflection point where they became a quote-unquote bad person because the change was too slow to register, and their internal mechanism for self-correction was already neutralized by that first small step.
Precisely. Then next, we have the self-serving bias. This is our powerful, innate tendency to process, gather, and remember information in a way that serves our self-interest and confirms what we already believe. This causes otherwise good people to make selfish, unfair decisions that are often glaringly obvious to an objective third party, but the actor remains completely blind to their own selfishness.
That makes perfect sense. I mean, if I cut someone off in traffic, my brain genuinely convinces me that they were driving too slowly and deserved it. But if it happens to me, the other driver is clearly a sociopath who should be arrested. We are excellent at spotting this bias in others, but nearly immune to recognizing it in ourselves.
That's the exact mechanism at work. And think about it in a corporate context with whistleblowers. The executive leadership often genuinely believes they're acting ethically, despite obvious wrongdoing, because their perception is filtered entirely through self-preservation and self-justification.
And then there is framing. How does that work?
Framing is the tendency to make drastically different decisions based solely on how a question or situation is presented. This can be ethically disastrous in organizational settings. For example, if a team's primary directive is framed as achieve market share at all costs, employees will instinctively prioritize aggression and rule bending. They won't see it as unethical, they'll see it as following the primary goal. The ethical standards just get displaced in the decision-making hierarchy because they aren't the primary frame.
So if the corporate culture frames speed as the #1 value, people will instinctively sacrifice safety without ever feeling like they made an unethical choice. They were just executing the mission as it was framed for them.
And finally, and maybe the most insidious, is the overconfidence bias. People consistently believe they are more ethical, more competent, and less biased than the average person. This overconfidence leads to insufficient reflection on decisions that have serious ethical implications. If you just assume, I'm a good person, therefore everything I do is inherently good, you remove the need to pause to check your motives or to seek external ethical counsel. You just accelerate into a bad decision without ever thinking about hitting the brakes.
So it sounds like our core problem is a combination of these intrinsic, universal psychological weaknesses, the slippage, the self-justification, the blind spots, and the fact that they're activated by any authoritative structure, whether it's sacred or secular, that demands blind obedience or facilitates that transfer of accountability.
That is the essential conclusion of all the social psychology we've explored. Whether it's the pressure from the experimenter in the lab coat, the command of a spiritual leader, the pressure from a financial bonus, or the demand of a military officer, the human tendency to diffuse responsibility is the critical risk factor. The authority is the accelerant, not the brake. We saw this in the Stanford prison experiment, a purely secular, arbitrary authority where the subjects rapidly embraced dehumanization and the diffusion of responsibility simply because the institutional structure allowed them to transfer that accountability.
Okay, this psychological analysis, in part, it paints a pretty pessimistic view of human nature. Our intuition is unreliable, our actions are easily dictated by external pressure and these cognitive failures, which I guess naturally leads us back to Berlinski's original point. Maybe external rules, absolute rules are necessary precisely because our instincts are so unreliable.
This moves us from the empirical psychology into philosophical metaethics, specifically something called divine command theory, or DCT. DCT is the philosophical position that moral propositions, what is right and what is wrong, get their truth value solely from their alignment with divine commands, with God's revealed will.
So the idea is that God is the source of morality, full stop. Something is good not because it maximizes happiness or because we rationally decided it was fair, but simply because God commanded it.
That's the core assertion, yes. For proponents of DCT, the belief in an omniscient, infallible God is what provides moral objectivity. The rules are objective because they originate outside the flawed, fallible human mind and in an infallible source.
But this immediately raises a classic philosophical tension, doesn't it? The Euthyphro dilemma.
Yes, it absolutely does. The Euthyphro dilemma asks, is an action morally right because God commands it, or does God command it because it is morally right?
And if the answer is the first one, that it's right because God commands it, that implies morality is arbitrary. God could theoretically command something monstrous, and by definition, it would become morally right.
That's the philosophical criticism of what's called voluntarism, the belief that morality is purely an act of divine will. If morality is arbitrary, it kind of undermines the concept of God being inherently good. However, if the answer is the other one, that God commands it because it is intrinsically right, then morality exists independently of God and God just recognizes and reveals it. This would mean morality has its own objective standards, which weakens the central claim of DCT.
It's a profound tension. But for the purposes of understanding the psychology of compliance, most adherents of DCT just treat the command as the ultimate authority, which brings them into alignment with a specific ethical framework. Deontology.
Precisely. DCT aligns perfectly with absolutist deontological ethics. Deontology, it comes from the Greek deondon, meaning duty. It asserts that certain acts are inherently right or wrong, regardless of the consequences. Lying, theft, murder, for example, are strictly forbidden. The moral worth of an action lies in its adherence to the rule or the duty.
Which, again, puts it in fundamental opposition to utilitarianism, which is purely outcome-based. Utilitarianism says we judge the morality of an action based on whether it maximizes the greatest good for the greatest number.
And DCT resists this entirely. The core implication is that divinely ordained rules must be respected, even if violating them would produce better overall outcomes for everyone involved. The duty is to God's law, not to human happiness or consequence.
Let's use a clear illustration of this rules over outcomes idea.
Okay, consider end-of-life ethics. Things like voluntary euthanasia or assisted suicide. A purely utilitarian framework might look at a person suffering from terminal pain with no hope of recovery and conclude that taking a life to assuage that suffering, if it maximizes overall happiness and minimizes pain for the patient and their family, is the moral choice. However, if a divine command forbids taking a life, if the sanctity of life is an absolute, non-negotiable duty, then DCT implies it is a moral duty not to violate that command, regardless of the humanitarian outcomes. The rule holds firm.
And this applies very strongly to specific social conservative values where the absence of harm is just irrelevant to the morality of the act.
Yes, exactly. For example, issues around sexuality or certain social practices. From a secular utilitarian perspective, if two consenting adults engage in a behavior that causes no demonstrable harm to others, there's no real moral reason to forbid it. Yet if an authoritative sacred text contains a rule forbidding that act, the absence of harm doesn't nullify the act's wrongness from a DCT standpoint. The command is absolute because of its divine origin.
And this directly explains that observable gap in moral stances we often see between highly religious and less religious individuals on those specific social issues.
Research confirms this. The endorsement of divine command theory is the critical mediating factor connecting general religiosity to non-utilitarian moral judgments. It's the mechanism that shifts people toward an absolutist deontological approach to ethics, especially on issues where the rules seem divorced from direct, observable consequences.
So it's not just a vague feeling of being religious that drives this rule-based thinking. It's the specific philosophical belief that morality is revealed by God and that our own human moral judgment is inherently inadequate or unreliable.
That belief in inadequacy brings us right back to the source material's discussion of human nature. Why do people accept the necessity of an absolute authority? Because many religious traditions, particularly within the Judeo-Christian tradition, operate with the doctrine of original sin.
The doctrine that posits human nature was corrupted by an initial act of disobedience, leaving us all inherently flawed and prone to sin.
And if human judgment is fundamentally flawed and fallible, if our sinful nature prevents us from reliably discerning right from wrong, then we absolutely need an external, infallible guide. This becomes the guidance function of divine rules. If you can't trust your own logic or intuition, which we just demonstrated empirically fails pretty easily in Part I, then absolute moral rules revealed by an external God become necessary to guide you. This belief system reinforces the need for an external authority that cannot be questioned.
So you don't trust yourself, so you outsource your moral GPS to a source you believe is infallible. And this is where the framework intersects with moral foundations theory, is that right?
Exactly. Jonathan Haidt's moral foundations theory, MFT, describes 5 main psychological systems that serve as the basis for moral judgment. And 3 of these, loyalty, authority, and sanctity, are often called the binding moral foundations because they function to limit individualism and bind people into cohesive hierarchical groups.
And what's the connection to DCT?
Our sources indicate that DCT endorsement fully mediates the relationship between religiosity and valuing those 3 binding foundations. Because holy texts, which believers see as containing God's revealed, will extensively cover topics pertaining to group loyalty, respect for hierarchy, that's authority, and sexual or bodily purity, sanctity. A DCT adherent accepts these as valued moral principles. The divine command provides the ultimate, unquestionable reason for valuing loyalty, authority, and sanctity over, say, individual autonomy or simple care and fairness concerns. The authority structure isn't just a guide, it's necessary for the very survival and cohesion of the moral group.
Okay, so we have established that psychologically, people easily outsource moral agency to authority.
Yeah.
And philosophically, many people justify that outsourcing by believing human nature is too flawed to govern itself. Now we need to look at what happens when those 2 systems, the psychological obedience and the rule-based authority, converge in really extreme contexts.
This is where we examine the Army of God, AOG, which serves as a really chilling case study in how the mechanisms of obedience and rule-based morality are integrated into a dangerous collective meaning system. The AOG is defined by leaderless resistance, which means it lacks a formal hierarchy, but it's bound by this potent, shared fundamentalist ideology.
And that shared ideology acts as the ultimate external authority, enabling violence by individuals who internalize its meaning. So what defines this fundamentalist ideology?
The research identifies 4 key characteristics. First is reactivity. This is a hostile perception of the external world. AOG members view U.S. society as a decadent, post-Christian nation that has fundamentally turned away from God. Abortion is identified as the primary sign of this decay and secularism, representing opposition to God's law. They often perceive the government itself as oppressive and anti-Christian. And this creates an environment where violence is viewed not as an action against society, but as a defense against chaos.
So they see themselves as defending some kind of sacred boundary that the rest of society has just abandoned.
Exactly. And this leads directly to the second feature, dualistic thinking. The world is framed in absolute terms, fixed categories of light and darkness, good and evil. The fight against abortion is not a policy disagreement, it's a cosmic war. Abortion clinics are constantly referred to as equivalent to concentration camps, slaughterhouses, or the gates of hell. This cognitive orientation enables extreme and rigorous social categorization, making it very simple to identify the enemy and justify extreme means.
And the third feature, absolutism and sanctification, seems to connect directly back to that divine command theory we were just discussing.
It does. The supreme, non-negotiable authority is God's word and his law. This leads to the sanctification of their goal. The belief that abortion is the destruction of something sacred life created in God's image. This transforms opposition into a holy duty, and it integrates it into the core identity of the individual. When the act of violence is prompted by a perceived calling or duty from God, it gains this directing power by becoming internalized into the self. It moves from being a choice to being a divine mandate.
And finally, there's selectivity. The idea that they intensely focus on abortion to the exclusion of other moral concerns.
Yes, and this extreme focus allows them to define true morality very, very narrowly. They view other Christians, even other pro-life activists, as phony, hypocritical, or spineless for believing in polite activism or compromise. The AOG ideology is defined by the absolute opposition to abortion and the belief that any means necessary, including force and lethal violence, are justified to prevent it.
And it's that necessity of violence that requires the cognitive work of moral disengagement. This is Albert Bandura's theory, right? Describing how individuals manage to bypass their own personal moral standards without fundamentally changing who they are.
Moral disengagement is the series of psychological maneuvers that allow people to justify inhumanity. The first and most common tactic is euphemistic language. This masks the harmful conduct and makes violent acts seem respectable or necessary. They replace the moral condemnation of murder with sterile terms like justified homicide, defensive action, or using deadly force.
So their language actually changes the character of the action itself in their minds.
Yes. They are careful to assert that those who use lethal force to stop a murderer, kill or terminate or slay or neutralize, they do not murder. By shifting the terminology, they remove the moral stigma. Similarly, they use emotionally charged language for the clinics themselves, calling them abortuaries or baby butcheries, to preemptively justify the aggression against them.
And next is how they handle accountability, which seems to tie directly back to our Milgram discussion.
That's displacement of responsibility. They sidestep ownership of the violence by blaming it on a higher, infallible source. Their actions are necessary because God's law commands us to protect the innocent, or the Lord has called his people to war. They see themselves as merely instruments of divine will. They also displace responsibility onto external forces, namely the evil, oppressive government that sanctions baby killers. The responsibility is never theirs. It's always an external decree or a necessary reaction.
And to make the violence not just acceptable but desirable, the victim has to be cognitively transformed.
This is dehumanization and demonization. Violence becomes easier once the victim is stripped of human qualities, denying their humanness to make the act acceptable or desirable or even necessary. Abortion providers are referred to as mass murderers or attributed bestial or demonic qualities. This frames the struggle as a cosmic apocalyptic war where the U.S. is in league with Satan. This dualistic thinking provides the absolute permission structure for extreme violence.
And the final psychological tactic is advantageous comparison.
This justifies their violence by placing it next to a far greater, more comprehensive evil, which makes their own actions seem trivial or even benevolent by comparison. By comparing abortion clinics directly to Nazi death camps, they create a moral equivalence that reframes their violent actions not as aggression but as defensive heroics. Their violence is justified as preventing a greater suffering and bloodshed, which provides a powerful psychological incentive. They gain significance and self-worth from this cognitive restructuring.
What's so sobering is that this pattern, the sacralization of a cause, the transfer of responsibility, the dehumanization of the enemy, this is simply an extreme manifestation of accountability problems that plague large, centralized religious institutions everywhere.
That is the essential institutional critique. Across Abrahamic faiths, Catholicism, Orthodox Judaism, Shia Islam, even decentralized Protestantism, we see consistent struggles with accountability in hierarchical systems. The institutions are often paralyzed by the tension between their spiritual mission and the priority of institutional self-preservation.
And that claim to divine authority acts as a functional shield.
Precisely. If a leader or an institution claims to represent a divine, infallible authority, it inherently resists external oversight. This is why centralized structures enable systematic cover-ups, as we tragically saw documented in the Catholic Church abuse scandals. The institution's vertical hierarchy prioritized self-preservation, spending vast sums over $5 billion in the U.S. alone since 2004 on abuse-related costs related to thousands of credible victims. That money represents the cost of institutional loyalty overriding moral justice.
But I've heard the argument that decentralized structures are better because they don't have that central hierarchy to corrupt.
They are simply different, not necessarily better. Decentralized structures, like many Protestant denominations, don't necessarily fare better in terms of abuse incidences. They often just lack the coordinated tracking systems. The core problem is the concentration of power coupled with the claim to spiritual infallibility, regardless of the size of the unit. This environment fosters religious abuse.
And how exactly is spiritual abuse defined in this context?
It is the misuse of authority to enforce strict, harmful rules, to shame dissenters, or to require submission without the right to dissent. The core mechanism is using a spiritual claim like, God wants you to submit to the leader, or challenging this decision is an act of spiritual pride to remove the victim's right to critical thought. It's intimidation, unreasonable control of basic free will, or false accusations used to label a person as disobedient or lacking faith. In centralized systems, the abuser's perceived divine position creates an environment of total infallibility, making it incredibly difficult for the victim to question or report the actions. The person is essentially trapped in an inescapable ethical dilemma powered by the fear of eternal consequence.
And the psychological toll of this kind of chronic religious abuse is significant, leading to what is now clinically referred to as religious trauma syndrome, or RTS.
RTS is experienced by people struggling with the psychological damage of indoctrination after leaving an authoritarian dogmatic religion. And the symptoms are severe. They affect fundamental identity and cognitive function. Victims exhibit confusion, difficulty with critical thinking, and profound identity confusion because their entire moral frame of reference was externally imposed. Affective issues include anxiety, depression, overwhelming guilt, and the pervasive fear of judgment. This just demonstrates that using authority to enforce belief systems, even if ostensibly well-intentioned, can induce severe psychological trauma by systematically dismantling a person's internal moral agency.
It all ties back to the story of the man we mentioned in the opening, the man who pressed the shock button because the authority told him to. The external structure provided a shield against his personal responsibility. He didn't lose his morality, he just outsourced it entirely. The philosopher's riddle about the moral break seems to have missed the point entirely.
It really did. The solution can't be merely finding a new, supposedly better supervisor, whether that's divine, scientific, or corporate. The solution has to be in cultivating the internal capacity to resist any supervisor when they command an unethical act.
Okay, so if the psychological data shows that our internal moral break is so easily disengaged by authority and corrupted by all these cognitive biases, what are the practical, actionable steps for reclaiming moral agency? How do we build an internal resistance mechanism?
Well, the initial step, and this is emphasized in behavioral ethics training, is cultivating moral awareness. As we discussed, most people suffer from moral myopia or ethical fading. They literally don't see the ethical issue in front of them because their focus is entirely consumed by immediate tasks: pleasing a boss, fitting in, meeting production targets. They assume, because of overconfidence, that because they're good people, they will automatically navigate the ethical waters correctly.
But we now know that assumption is the most dangerous cognitive error of all. So we have to actively keep our ethical antenna extended.
Absolutely. The goal is to actively combat the great enemy of moral progress, which is rationalization. We have to learn to monitor ourselves and recognize the verbal or cognitive alarms that sound when we're about to neutralize our own moral intent.
And what are the primary rationalizations we should be listening for, in ourselves and in others?
You should listen for language that diminishes the severity of the act. Things like, "It's not my fault," that's displacement of responsibility. Or, "No one will really be hurt," denial of injury, "he deserved it," attribution of blame. Or the classic Milgram-like excuse, "If I don't do it, someone else will." When you hear yourself or others using these predictable patterns of justification, it should trigger an immediate alarm because they are reliable indicators that an unethical action is being considered, or worse, is already underway.
Awareness is step one, but moving from awareness to action, especially when you're facing an institutional or a sacred hierarchy, that requires immense courage. Knowing what's right and having the backbone to actually speak up about it are entirely different things.
This is the revolutionary insight behind training approaches like giving voice to values, or GVV, which was developed by Mary Gentile. GVV fundamentally shifts the focus of ethical education.
How so?
Instead of focusing on the decision-making phase, trying to figure out what is right, which is what traditional ethics training does, GVV focuses on the post-decision-making phase. It's about how to speak your mind when you already know what is right. It assumes you already know the ethical path, and it focuses purely on developing the skills and the scripts to articulate that value under pressure.
So it addresses the courage factor directly. It's training people to act on their morality rather than just debate it. How do they actually train for that kind of moral courage?
They use very practical techniques, particularly prescripting. This involves anticipating difficult ethical scenarios, say a supervisor telling you to cook the books, and deciding and rehearsing your response in advance. You literally write out the lines you will deliver, practicing them over and over. This visualization and rehearsal makes the ethical decision less hypothetical and more like muscle memory when the pressure actually hits.
It's like practicing a fire drill, so when the emergency happens, you move instinctively instead of freezing.
Precisely. And the single most striking finding in GVV research, the element that makes the ethical decision really stick, is simply taking the step of voicing the value out loud. Those who acted ethically had, at some point, said something out loud and to someone outside their own heads, whether it was to a colleague, a family member, or a mentor. That single act forces the ethical commitment to take on a concrete, real form, making it much, much harder to walk back or avoid when the authority applies pressure.
And this internal strength, it has to be complemented by external accountability, right? The structures we've discussed, religious, corporate, scientific, they all need robust external oversight.
Without external scrutiny, internal self-preservation mechanisms will always win. The research demonstrates that institutional structures, across all forms of authority, often prioritize loyalty and obedience over truth and justice. The only way to break that cycle is to place limits on authority.
You think about cases of whistleblowers. We had the example of a finance worker named Miriam working for a massive international charity that claimed a divine mandate. The organization did immense positive work, but Miriam discovered a systematic diversion of funds meant for refugee relief into lavish personal expenses for senior leadership.
That's the classic institutional failure, the good works providing cover for internal corruption that's shielded by spiritual claims.
Her supervisor immediately pulled the shame card, telling her she was sowing discord, and that challenging the leadership was an act of spiritual pride and disobedience. Miriam chose individual integrity over institutional loyalty. Instead of engaging in incrementalism or rationalizing the abuse, she spent months documenting the trail and eventually leaks the files to a secular oversight committee.
Miriam's action was a profound assertion of moral agency. Her betrayal of the sacred authority was, in fact, an act of justice. The evidence suggests that no authority, not the lab coat, not the CEO, and certainly not a system claiming a divine mandate, is so sacred that it should be exempt from ethical scrutiny and the limits imposed by individual conscience.
So the final conclusion drawn from all this social psychology, all this ethics, all this institutional analysis is clear. The path forward requires robust individual critical thinking, coupled with relentless mandated external oversight.
Absolutely. The true moral break is not finding a new supervisor to fear or obey. It is the limit placed on authority, coupled with the individual's cultivated capacity for personal responsibility and moral courage to challenge that authority when it demands an unethical act.
What we've seen today is a comprehensive empirical argument against that initial philosophical premise. The core problem of human morality isn't the absence of a divine moral break. It is the fundamental human danger of sacralizing any form of authority and subsequently suspending individual critical judgment.
Whether that authority is a scientific decree, a political ideology, or a sacred text interpreted by a hierarchical organization, the human tendency to outsource accountability and responsibility is the critical risk factor in generating unethical behavior. It leads directly to moral disengagement and trauma.
The ultimate goal of ethical education, therefore, isn't to provide a new set of external rules or a checklist of commandments for people to blindly follow. It's to enhance the internal critical capacity for the individual to recognize the rationalization and find the courage, through prescripting and voicing values, to say no to the group when required. We have to demand transparency and accountability, not just faith and obedience.